Absent Landlord, The Chronicles of a Crumbling House, by Ross Spoon, which is me. May the hands I have been given give freely. For Bonnie Lee Rasmussen, who never ceased telling me her stories. I hope you found a home, Bonnie, and I hope lilies and fireflies surround it. And this audiobook recording is for my dear, dear friend Paige, who is in the hospital right now, dealing with her chronic pain disease that she's had for years. But on top of that, she has COVID-19 and is struggling to breathe. This is for you, Paigey. I love you, sister. Stuck window. Seth fails again. Seth knelt on the dirty carpet and pressed the worn, smooth buttons on the old plastic telephone, looking at the phone number between each hesitant jab. The wooden side table wobbled, making the phone a moving target. Seth looked at the pug dog wheezing up at him. "What are you looking at? You wait till today to pay attention to me?" The dog looked behind her, as if she heard something through the dented screen door on the front porch. Seth looked back to the phone, realizing he had lost his place yet again, and clenched his jaw, frustrated at himself. Just then, a squinty-eyed, wrinkly lady with a swept-back forehead and long, oily hair swung the creaky screen door open and bustled in, bringing with her the sounds from the hot August evening. Over her shoulder hung a duffel bag of oxygen bottles, one of which was tethered to her face with a plastic tube. She wore a navy green turtleneck under a vest with Christmas icons and tinsel knitted into it. She glanced at Seth and, without pausing, said matter-of-factly in her raspy voice, "Your peanuts are about to fall out." She lumbered around the corner, a sneeze exploded from her, and her oxygen bag banged against the gurgling water heater in the hallway. Her beige heads patted down the dirty cement to her room. Seth's splotchy, flat, middle-aged face appeared perplexed until he looked down and saw his fly was completely open. He clenched his lips together, embarrassed and disappointed in himself. He hung up the phone and zipped up. He closed his eyes and forced himself to take a deep breath. He could not see the comical gaps in Miss Muffin's teeth, or find the humor in the tube that shot from her nose like a cork when she sneezed. He only felt her caustic voice and her sharp bite. "Okay." He looked at the dog and spoke to her like mothers he had seen getting annoyed at their kids in his supermarket. "I'm getting really sick of this." Even nice people fling blame when it's too hard to face any more of their own failure. He finally successfully dialed, and as it rang, he grappled for his splaying pocket notepad on the dancing table. Then he held it 6 inches in front of his face, ready to read the blue scribblings on the top page. The phone rang and rang. "Why don't you even answer? You're probably not even there." Seth looked down at the dog, realizing the dog had heard him, and started to explain himself to her. They told me he got me a place in this house and could call him whenever I wanted, but he just never seems to answer his..." The generic voicemail prompt piped in and interrupted him. After the beep, he slowly read the following haiku from the notepad. "I'm leaving. Thanks for letting me live in your house." Seth squinted at the page. Something wasn't right. He counted the syllables of the last line on his fingers, rolled his eyes at his latest failure, and tried to rephrase it. I'm leaving. Thanks for letting me, use your house." He hung up firmly with clenched jaw. He leaned over the dirty couch next to the table and pinned his notepad against the wall with his hand. His knobby fingers pulled a blue, multicolored pen from his pocket and tried to correct the last line, but the pen wouldn't write because it was tilted slightly upside down. He was shaking the pen when Miss Muffin lumbered back around the corner, holding a small slip of paper she had torn from the door of Seth's room, which was next to hers. It was a ragged sheet ripped from his little notebook. She jammed her finger into her ear to make sure her hearing aid was snug, and asked in her abrupt, raspy voice, "What's this all about?" She looked at the paper and read, "Goodbye, all. You may have my things. Have good lives." Seth shrugged hesitantly, hoping that he had found someone who cared. Miss Muffin reached into her bag and pulled out a mini megaphone. She thought Seth, as well as everyone else, could hear about as well as she could, and so she was always prepared to compensate. She repeated her question through the blaring megaphone, and Seth winced. Then he answered with another, less certain shrug. Miss Muffin looked his skinny body up and down surreptitiously. He had some food stuck to his faded blue, oversized polo shirt. His shoes were floppy white Walmart skate shoes. The zipper of his cinched-up gray jeans hadn't quite stayed at the top rung. She finally focused on his multicolored pen in his hand. She pointed at it and raised her eyebrows in a question. Seth looked at the pen too, and realized she was asking for it. He handed it to her, assuming she was going to write something for him, but she took it, tested it unsuccessfully on her hand, wet the tip with her gray tongue, and then got it to write. She stuffed it into her pocket, satisfied to have claimed it before anyone else, and walked down the hallway into her room, dropping his note to the floor. It drifted down with the grace of an autumn leaf, but to Seth, it just looked like something fading. He didn't see the swallows swooping on the porch beyond the window in the dusky light. He didn't see the one flower that had bloomed above the 12-inch-high sea of weeds in the yard. Seth looked around him and saw the peeling, faded layers of ancient wallpaper, the drooping screen door, the cracking ceiling, the grimy edges of the room. It was all squeezing in on him, like he were a tube of toothpaste. So he started his ascent. He walked through the hallway, dodging a gummy bear, which had recently been trampled onto the cement floor and now attracted an army of ants. And he started clunking up the creaky stairs at the end of the hall. The dog sniffed the gummy bear and then caught up with Seth. The black shoe scuffs on the first landing were what caught Seth's eye. He did not see the huge, faded, painted mural of a beautiful city on the walls wrapping around him. Seth got to the top of the stairs and slowly walked down the hall. He could hear voices clearly on the other side of the thin wall next to him. A man's voice asked patiently, "I mean, you said you're not on the pill anymore, right, honey?" "Of course not, John. Do you think I'm stupid?" Baby, I'm sorry. Calm down. I'm just trying to eliminate the obvious possibilities." There was a moment of silence. Then the man's voice chimed back in hesitantly. "Honey, maybe it's because maybe something happened when you were in the hospital." "John!" She was angry. "I knew you were going to bring that up and try to use it against me. Just because I was experienced and you were completely prude when we got married, and because I happened to have some problems down there, you think that I messed up my parts. Well, how do we know it's not your parts that don't work?" There was another pause, and then she blew up. "Shut up! Take that stupid smirk off your face. That still doesn't mean it's not your fault." A pause, and then she continued. "I'm getting out of here. If you didn't have such a scummy job, maybe we could get a place away from all these crazies and could have because I would know people wouldn't hear us through these paper-thin walls." She swung open the door, and Seth froze in mid-step in front of the door. He turned and looked at Leanne's fuming face and John's exhausted one in the room beyond it. She slammed the door between them, and Seth heard her frustration pour out of her, sounding like a train whistle on a chainsaw. Seth walked like a zombie past the room, effectively tased by the experience. He whispered to the dog, which followed close behind. "I'm not even a manager at McDonald's like John. I'm just a stupid bagger at Leaker's. What does that mean she thinks of me? You see what I mean? Nobody wants me here. They think I'm just dumb and crazy." He looked down at the dog, which was focused attentively on Seth's every move. This made him feel a little bit better, but not enough to keep him from doing what he was going to do. He got to the reading room at the end of the hall and walked to a window. He grasped the little handles on the window and struggled to slide it up. It would not budge. He finally relented, and as he did, he noticed his defeated 35-year-old reflection in the rattling glass. His spirit fell even more. He pinched at a big pimple tucked between his nose and his cheek. Then he brushed his hair from the side of his head over his bald spot. "It's not fair," he said to himself. "Even my body treats me like a stupid, pimply teenager and an old, bald geezer." He poured all his blame into the last word. Then he noticed something stuck to his shirt and looked down. A clump of beans and rice had somehow dried onto his shirt just under his curled-over cotton collar. He brushed it off. The dog leapt for and caught it before it reached the floor. Then she trotted away down the stairs, licking her little chops. Seth watched her disappear, and his eyes brimmed with tears. He looked back at himself in the window's reflection, but decided he couldn't bear the pathetic sight anymore. He moved to the next window in the reading room, and after a couple of tries, realized he hadn't unlocked it. He scowled at himself for his latest mistake, unlatched it, and jerked it open with some difficulty. He looked around the room one last time, with its scuffs and oily hand smears, its black, cracked leather reading chair, and that toppling stack of old mail that had been under the window since he could remember. He said a quiet goodbye. Seth lifted his foot to step out of the window, but stopped when he saw a strip of toilet paper stuck to his heel. "Dang it!" he cursed, but not technically in his mind, and looked around to see if anyone had seen. He plucked the paper from his shoe and wadded it up. He looked for a trash can but couldn't find one, so he resorted to putting it in his back pocket instead of littering. He climbed out of the window onto the roof. The buzz of cicadas and the heat of the Kansas summer dusk hit him. He steadied himself against the house. Some of the big lights blinked on in the park a few blocks away. The sounds of Little League baseball drifted past him. "I mess things up for everybody." Quietly, he made excuses why even the beauty wasn't enough to keep him around. Seth scooted to the edge of the roof. The smell of someone barbecuing reached his nose. "I can't even cook. I just get in the way." He peeked over at the ground 15 feet below him, reeling back at the seemingly huge distance. A flock of geese flew in formation far above, honking among their posse. "I don't even really have any friends," he argued. "And Mom, who even has old-timers, she doesn't even really remember who I am anymore. And now I can't get any more of my depression pills from her that I'm almost out of." The leaves of the tall oak tree in the backyard rustled in the wind. "And leakers just gave me a job because they felt sorry for me, just like their other baggers. I'm smart enough to figure that out." He pondered for a minute, remembering the one thing that made him feel smart, and silently mouthed the words. "The only thing in the world I'm good at is writing haikus." He remembered his 6th grade teacher, Ms. Fawcett, the first one he ever liked. She taught him how to write haikus when he couldn't do the work the other kids were doing. Ms. Fawcett had told Seth that he was at his best with bite-sized pieces of life. "Like sushi," she had added. "Have you ever had sushi?" He would probably love sushi, he thought. He really loved Miss Fawcett. Seth heard the clopping of tall heels coming down the sidewalk in the front yard. A busty Mexican woman wearing an old trench coat threw her head from side to side, trying to conceal her face in her wavy black hair. The tall weeds on either side of the sidewalk rustled as rabbits darted away from the approaching high-heel skewers. She kept her fist close to her face, sucking on a lollipop. Her long, bare legs emerged partly from her coat at every step. Nayeli. Seth watched her until she disappeared from view, onto the porch where she started going off on somebody in Spanish. Sometimes she came home acting weird like this, and dressed really weird, with lots of makeup and not a lot of clothes. but the ones she did wear were tight and small. She usually cooked a lot on these nights. Seth loved her cooking, and she loved her own cooking. Seth had noticed that. In fact, it kind of scared him sometimes how much she liked eating. Seth paused and listened. She was probably going off on Miss Muffin, or maybe nobody at all. Sometimes she did that too. Seth looked to the ground again, trying to figure out how to throw himself over so that it would be final, but it wouldn't be so high that it would hurt. He didn't know how to do this, but he couldn't fail at this like everything else. The steps to the front porch would be less distance to fall, so he crawled across the roof to the overhang above them. Laying on his stomach, Seth's head faced downward on the roof. He awkwardly reached into his pocket for his notebook. "Darn it!" he silently cursed when he realized he had left it downstairs. A moment later he remembered the toilet paper, pulled it out of his back pocket, and uncrumpled it to try and write on it. This was the perfect time to write his last haiku, looking down at life from above. Once things settled down below, he could finish the haiku and do what he came up here to do. But when he reached into his other front pocket, he remembered that Miss Muffin had taken his pen. He gritted his teeth and clenched his fists. But after 20 seconds, Seth just relented and gave up on everything. What good would it do him now to care? He let his face rest on the rough asphalt shingles. Just then, he heard Miss Muffin open the screen door, her bag of bottles banging against the doorframe. Her raspy voice cautioned Nayeli. "You should be careful what you say, honey. They can hear everything you say. And they know Spanish too, I'm sure of it. They can translate to any language with the wide world web and that stuff. They've got microphones and cameras everywhere. Probably on this deck somewhere, in fact. I'm sure of it. Probably right up there. You no understand my life. My sister no let me come her house to see my little sobrinos no more. She think I too dirty. She no understand why I have to leave like these." Miss Muffin continued in her raspy voice. "I'm just saying, honey, that you should be careful where you shoot your mouth off. They're gonna know, and it's gonna be really bad, you know. Really, really." She stopped and interrupted herself. "Oh, maybe there's one of them now. Hope you're ready, honey." Seth looked up and saw a familiar homeless man waddling down the sidewalk. He was big and round. One of his legs was short, and the big black boot on that foot had to be supplemented with 6 inches of extra black rubber sole, causing him to limp. His shape and his long white beard made Seth wonder if he was really Santa Claus in disguise. But Santa Claus probably never came around anymore either, if he even existed. The hobo wore a green baseball cap and overalls atop a faded blue mechanic suit. They often saw him wandering around the town with a shopping cart, and he didn't usually bother anybody. But this time, he approached the house with purpose. His eyes darted from one window to the next, looking for something or someone inside the house. He had not yet seen Seth lying on the roof in front of him. Just then, Seth heard a door slam, and Leanne stomped down the stairs, probably because she needed to get out of the house and away from all these crazies. John's footsteps followed hers. Seth cringed at the impending collision of all of them on the porch. The dirty homeless man, the angry Mexican woman, the paranoid Miss Muffin, and now the claustrophobic Leanne and her desperate husband John. Seth squeezed the toilet paper in his hand and braced for the encounter. He looked at the hobo who almost disappeared from view under the overhang. But the hobo slowed as he noticed Nayeli and heard her voice crack into sadness. "You all think I too dirty." A compassionate look came across the hobo's face. He reached out and stepped toward her, as if he wanted to put a comforting hand on her shoulder. He disappeared from Seth's view. Nayeli yelped in surprise. No, senor, you cannot touch this for free. Váyate, you dirty." At that moment, Leanne threw open the screen door, arguing with John, who was close behind. She cried, "There's just too many effing people here." She paused when she saw everybody. First glad that they wouldn't think she was a bad person because she hadn't really cursed, but then realized that it was the effing people that heard her. That canceled it all out. Then she saw the disheveled hobo encroaching into their already packed house and put her head in her hands, crying desperately, "Does anybody up there even care?" The hobo backed up several steps when he saw the horrified look on Leanne's face. Seth could see him again. The big, round man, his white beard and sad, compassionate eyes, stood in the fading sunlight, wanting to help the crying women that just wanted him to leave. Two things went through Seth's head. First, he thought, "I hope nobody notices me here." But his second thought was much stronger. Poor Leanne could really use a tissue right now. And before he realized it, he had opened his clenched hand and dropped the ball of toilet paper off the roof. As if in slow motion, like a cloud descending from heaven, the ball drifted down and unfurled in front of the hobo. He saw it in time to catch it. They were all silent for a moment. Everyone looked up, but only the hobo could see Seth's caring eyes looking down from over the gutter. The hobo smiled, an old, deep-creased smile. Then he broke the toilet paper into two parts and held one out to Leanne and the other to Nayeli. They both hesitated, waiting for the other to act, then both politely declined it. Miss Muffin rasped proudly, "See? I told you someone's always watching us. I knew it!" She then turned to walk inside. John smirked. "I guess someone up there does care, baby." He figured it must be Seth and smiled. "Why don't you come back inside, honey?" Nayeli dabbed the dark eyeliner with the back of her hand. She was feeling more comfortable now that the hobo was backing away, but also starting to doubt that this was just a normal hobo. Most of the group trickled back into the house, but the hobo looked up at Seth. A small smile crept onto the old man's face. He seemed relieved about something. Seth, knowing he had been found out and his efforts thwarted yet again, slowly gathered himself up and moved to go inside. Once the homeless man knew that Seth was on his way in, he sighed, slowly turned, and limped back toward the street. Pulling an old cell phone from his pocket, the hobo started to push the buttons, but when he saw a single flower reaching above the sea of weeds in the yard, he leaned over and took a deep whiff. Before he got to the street, he glanced once more to make sure Seth got inside, then put his fat thumbs and ancient eyes to the task of deleting a voicemail on his phone. Miss Muffin's raspy voice could be heard mumbling to herself as she wandered around the house. "I knew someone was always watching us. I just knew it."